Moscow, December 25, 1991. The red banner comes down from the Kremlin. The cameras capture it. The world watches. History books will tell you that communism died because it was morally bankrupt. They will tell you it collapsed under the weight of ideology. They will tell you that freedom defeated tyranny. But that's not what happened. The Soviet Union didn't lose a philosophical debate. It went broke. It ran out of cash. The empire that built nuclear submarines and put men in space couldn't buy bread for its citizens. This is not a story about ideas. This is a story about oil, debt, and a balance sheet that stopped adding up. The year is 1980. Look at the Soviet Union from the outside. 11 time zones of territory. 40,000 nuclear warheads sitting in silos. 4 million soldiers in uniform. Tanks that could roll from Berlin to Paris in 72 hours. To anyone watching from Washington or London, this looked like an empire built to last centuries. The parades in Red Square showed rows of missiles. The propaganda films showed factories churning out steel. The Politburo members stood on the balcony in their heavy coats, looking powerful and permanent. But empires are not built on missiles. They are built on money. And if you looked at the actual ledgers, if you saw the classified reports inside the Soviet Ministry of Finance, you would see something terrifying. You would see a superpower running on fumes. By the early 80s, the Soviet economy was a fraud. The factories were inefficient. The technology was 20 years behind the West. The collective farms couldn't grow enough wheat to feed the population. The system was broken. But the Soviet Union had gotten lucky. In the 1970s, the price of oil exploded. The Arab embargo sent crude prices to the moon. Billions of dollars in hard currency poured into Moscow. It was a miracle. The Kremlin used that oil money to paper over the cracks. They bought grain from America and Canada to feed their people. They bought technology they couldn't invent themselves. They funded communist regimes in Cuba, Vietnam, and Angola. They waged war in Afghanistan. The Soviet Union had become a petro-state. It was no longer an industrial superpower. It was a gas station with nuclear weapons. And like any addict, it needed the high to continue. As long as oil stayed expensive, the system survived. But addiction is fragile. And someone in Washington had noticed. January 1981. Ronald Reagan walks into the White House. He brings with him a team of cold warriors who are tired of détente. They don't want to contain the Soviet Union. They want to destroy it. Among them is William Casey, the new director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Casey is not a diplomat. He is a spy, an accountant, and a killer. He served in the USA during World War II, running operations behind Nazi lines. He understands that wars are won with logistics, not just bullets. Casey orders a secret study of the Soviet economy. The CIA analysts dig into the numbers. The report that lands on his desk is a weapon. It shows that the Soviet Union earns up to 80% of its hard currency from oil and gas exports. It shows that the Kremlin needs oil prices to stay above a certain level just to function. If the price drops, the Soviet budget doesn't just shrink, it collapses. Casey realizes he's found the jugular. But America can't lower the price of oil on its own. The United States is a buyer, not a seller. To crash the market, Casey needs a partner. He needs a country that pumps so much oil it can flood the world. He needs Saudi Arabia. The relationship between Washington and Riyadh in the early 80s is complicated. The Saudis control OPEC, They like high oil prices because it makes them rich. Why would they agree to destroy their own revenue just to help America fight the Russians? Casey knows he has to offer them something more valuable than money. He has to offer them survival. The Middle East in the 80s is a war zone. The Iranian Revolution just happened. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan and are creeping closer to the Saudi oil fields. The Saudi royal family is terrified. They see enemies everywhere. Casey flies to Riyadh. The meetings are held in private palaces, far from diplomats and journalists. We don't have transcripts. But we know what happened next. Casey lays out the Soviet threat in vivid detail. He tells the Saudis that Moscow is encircling the region. He offers them American military protection, IWACS surveillance planes, Stinger missiles, F-15 fighter jets, a guarantee that if anyone tries to overthrow the House of Saud, America will intervene. In exchange, he asks for one thing: open the taps, flood the market, crash the price of oil. The Saudis hesitate. Lowering oil prices will hurt their own revenue, but Casey appeals to their fear. He tells them it's better to be a safe ally of the United States with less cash than a rich victim of Soviet aggression. He also appeals to their religious duty. The Soviets are slaughtering Muslims in Afghanistan. By bankrupting Moscow, the Saudis would be striking a blow for the faith. The arguments work. The alliance is formed. It is an economic suicide pact for the Kremlin, signed in the desert. While Casey works the diplomatic channels, the Reagan administration tightens the screws in other ways. They block the construction of a massive Soviet gas pipeline to Europe. They convince European banks to stop lending money to Moscow. They force the Soviets to spend more on their military to keep up with American defense spending. The goal is to stretch the Soviet budget to the breaking point, so that when the oil shock comes, the system snaps. By 1985, the stage is set. In Moscow, a new leader takes power. Mikhail Gorbachev is young and energetic. He knows the economy is in trouble. He plans to fix it with a program called perestroika, or restructuring. But Gorbachev is operating under a fatal assumption. He assumes the oil money will keep flowing. He writes his budgets based on oil staying at around $30 a barrel. He believes he has a safety net. He doesn't know that William Casey and the Saudi king have already cut the ropes. In the summer of 1985, the Saudis make their move. For years, Saudi Arabia has been acting as the swing producer of OPEC. They cut their own production to keep prices high for everyone else. They're getting tired of this role. Other countries are cheating on their quotas and selling more oil while the Saudis hold back. The Saudis warn the other OPEC members that they won't support the price forever. No one listens. They think the Saudis are bluffing. In September 1985, the Saudi oil minister, Ahmed Zaki Yamani, makes an announcement. He declares that Saudi Arabia is changing its policy. The kingdom will no longer protect the price of oil. Instead, they will fight for market share. It sounds like a boring technical statement. But in the trading pits of New York and London, the traders know what it means. The dam has broken. The Saudis turn on the pumps. They have massive surplus capacity. Within weeks, they flood the market with millions of extra barrels every day. The world is suddenly swimming in oil. Supply far exceeds demand. The laws of economics take over with brutal speed. The price begins to slide. $30 becomes $28, then $25, then $20. In Moscow, the initial reaction is confusion. The Soviet planners have seen price fluctuations before. They assume it's a temporary dip. They assume the market will correct itself. They don't realize this is a structural shift engineered by their enemies. They keep spending money they don't have. They keep fighting the war in Afghanistan. They keep subsidizing Poland, East Germany, and Cuba. They're burning through their hard currency reserves at a terrifying rate, waiting for the price to bounce back. But the price doesn't bounce back. It keeps falling. As winter 1985 turns into spring 1986, the oil market goes into freefall. The Saudis are relentless. They keep pumping. Every $1 drop in the price of a barrel costs the Soviet Union roughly $1 billion in lost revenue per year. When the price drops to $10, the Soviets lose tens of billions. That's money they need to buy food. It's hard to overstate how dependent the Soviet Union is on imported grain. The inefficiency of collective farming means the superpower can't feed itself. They rely on American and Canadian wheat. They have to pay for that wheat in hard currency or gold. They can't pay in rubles because nobody wants rubles. The ruble is a closed currency with no value outside the USSR. Oil is literally bread. When the oil price crashes, the bread line breaks. By early 1986, the panic in the Kremlin is real. Gorbachev is receiving secret memos from his finance ministers. They tell him the coffers are empty. They tell him they can't afford to import the machinery needed to modernize factories. They tell him they might have to cut imports of consumer goods. Gorbachev is facing a nightmare. He promised the Soviet people a better life. He promised reform. But you can't reform an economy when you're broke. You can only manage the decline. The timing couldn't be worse. In April 1986, the nuclear reactor at Chernobyl explodes. The disaster costs the Soviet Union billions in cleanup and relocation. It's a massive, unexpected expense at the exact moment when their income has evaporated. It's the perfect storm. A financial attack combined with a technological catastrophe. The Soviet leadership is overwhelmed. But the Americans aren't done. They keep the pressure on. They encourage the Saudis to keep prices low. They tell the Saudis this is hurting the common enemy. The Saudis, rich enough to weather the storm thanks to their massive savings, keep the taps open. They're driving the price down to levels that make it impossible for the Soviet oil industry to make a profit. The Soviet oil fields in Siberia are expensive to operate. They require complex technology in harsh conditions. At $10 a barrel, it costs the Soviets more to pump the oil than they can sell it for. Their greatest asset has become a liability. The psychological impact on the Soviet elite is devastating. For decades they believed history was on their side. They believed capitalism was weak and destined to fail. But now they're being taught a harsh lesson in capitalist economics. They're realizing their entire system is a house of cards built on the luck of high oil prices. Without that luck, they're nothing. The confidence of the Communist Party begins to crack. They start to fight among themselves. The hardliners blame Gorbachev for the chaos. Gorbachev blames the hardliners for the inefficiency, but neither side can solve the math problem. They're bankrupt. This financial crisis triggers a chain reaction that will eventually bring down the Berlin Wall. The Soviet Union has an empire to run. It has satellite states in Eastern Europe like East Germany, Poland, and Czechoslovakia. For decades, Moscow subsidized these countries. They sold them cheap oil and gave them direct financial aid. It was the glue that held the Warsaw Pact together. But when the cash runs out in Moscow, the subsidies stop. Gorbachev has to tell the leaders of Eastern Europe they're on their own. He tells them the Soviet Union can no longer afford to support them. He famously calls it the Sinatra Doctrine, meaning they can do it their way. He doesn't do this because he's a nice guy who believes in freedom. He does it because he's broke. Once the people of Eastern Europe realize the Soviet tanks aren't coming because the Soviets can't afford the gas, they rise up. The revolutions of 1989 are powered by the spirit of liberty, but they're made possible by the bankruptcy of the oppressor. The oil weapon is a silent killer. It doesn't destroy buildings. It doesn't kill soldiers on the battlefield. It destroys balance sheets. It hollows out the state from the inside. It turns a superpower into a beggar. And the most remarkable thing is that almost no one sees it coming. The CIA analysts who wrote that initial report for William Casey were right. They identified the one thread that held the Soviet tapestry together. When Casey and the Saudis pulled that thread, the whole thing unraveled. The crash of 1986 is the moment the floor falls out from under the Soviet experiment. In the trading rooms of New York, the price of oil hits $10 a barrel. Adjusted for inflation, that's one of the lowest prices in the history of the oil age. For the American consumer, it's a party. Gas is cheap. The economy booms. But in the grim conference rooms of the Kremlin, it's a funeral. Mikhail Gorbachev looks at the numbers and realizes his grand plans for perestroika are dead on arrival. He later admits in his memoirs that the collapse of the oil price devastatingly impacted all their plans. It's an understatement. It's not just an impact. It's a fatality. The Soviet Union is now facing a liquidity crisis. This is a technical term for a very simple problem. They have bills to pay and no cash to pay them. The Soviet Union borrowed heavily from Western banks in the 70s when they thought the oil money would last forever. Now those loans are coming due. The Western bankers who once happily lent to Moscow suddenly get cold feet. They see the oil price crashing and they know the collateral is gone. They stop lending. The credit window slams shut. The Soviet Union is cut off from the global financial system. Gorbachev tries to improvise. He sends his diplomats to beg for loans from West Germany and even from the United States. It's a humiliation. The leader of the communist world asking the capitalists for a handout. But the loans come with strings attached. The West demands political reforms. They demand human rights. They demand the Soviets stop their aggression in Afghanistan. The financial weakness forces Gorbachev to make political concessions he never would have made if oil had been $30. The retreat of the Soviet Empire begins not on the battlefield, but at the loan officer's desk. The domestic situation in Russia deteriorates rapidly. The lack of hard currency means the state can't import consumer goods. The shelves in the stores, already bare, become completely empty. There's a shortage of everything. No soap, no sugar, no shoes, no medicine. The social contract of the Soviet Union is simple. The people give up their freedom and the state provides the basics of life. When the state can no longer provide the basics, the people begin to ask why they gave up their freedom. The anger in the streets grows. The strikes begin. The coal miners in Siberia put down their tools, not because of ideology, but because there's no soap to wash the coal dust off their faces. Meanwhile, the Saudi strategy is working perfectly. By keeping the price low, they're regaining their market share. They're driving high-cost producers out of business. but they're also reshaping the geopolitics of the world. The Saudis have proven that oil is more powerful than nuclear weapons. They've brought the other superpower to its knees without firing a shot. It cements the alliance between Washington and Riyadh. The United States realizes Saudi Arabia isn't just a gas station. It's a strategic asset. It's a weapon. This realization shapes American foreign policy for the next 30 years. It explains why the U.S. protects the Saudi royal family through every crisis. They know that in a pinch, the Saudis can turn the global economy on or off. As 1988 rolls into 1989, the Soviet Union is running on fumes. They begin to sell off their gold reserves. They sell tons of gold bars in London and Zurich just to buy wheat. It's a fire sale. They're selling the family silver to pay the grocery bill. But even the gold runs out. The economic desperation forces Gorbachev to cut the military budget. For decades, the Red Army has been the priority. It got the best men, the best steel, the best food. But now Gorbachev has to tell the generals the party is over. He slashes defense spending. He orders the withdrawal from Afghanistan, not just because the war is unwinnable, but because it's unaffordable. The retreating Soviet tanks crossing the bridge back into Russia are a symbol of an empire that has simply run out of gas. Then comes the final blow, the satellite states. For 40 years, the Soviet Union held Eastern Europe in an iron grip. But empires are expensive garrisons, subsidies, the works. By 1989, Gorbachev does the math. East Germany and Poland are costing billions he doesn't have. He makes the cold calculation to cut them loose. When Berliners hammer the wall that November, Soviet guards stand down, not for mercy, but because Moscow can't afford to act. The fall of the wall is celebrated as the triumph of the human spirit, but it's paid for by the collapse of oil prices. At $10 a barrel, the tanks stay in the barracks. At 30, history might have been different. On December 26, 1991, the USSR dissolves. Democracy triumphs, communism fails, but the hidden hero is the Saudi oil minister who opened the taps in 1985. Accountants and oil traders, not bombs, brought down a nuclear superpower. Resource-dependent states crumble when prices fall. Venezuela, Russia, the U.S. learned it. Empires fall when the math fails.